When Ethan and I first moved into Willow Heights, it felt like a new beginning, a chance to leave behind the struggles we've faced in other neighborhoods. For years, we had searched for a place where we could feel safe, accepted, and at home. Willow Heights seemed perfect. The houses weren't fancy or over the top, but they were cozy and welcoming. Mature oak trees lined the streets, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, creating an atmosphere that felt almost magical. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to dream, to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would be the place where Ethan and I could finally put down roots. Ethan is my son, and he's one of the most amazing people you'll ever meet. He's autistic, nonverbal, and experiences the world differently because of sensory sensitivities. But what he lacks in words, he makes up for in kindness and curiosity. His favorite thing to do is sit on our porch and watch birds flutter from tree to tree. Sometimes he sketches them in his notebook with such care and detail that it takes your breath away. It's his way of connecting with the world around him, his own special language. Watching him find joy in the little things fills my heart with pride. What really drew me to Willow Heights wasn't just the charm of the neighborhood, it was the promise of community. The HOA brochure painted a picture of inclusivity, support, and shared values. It talked about neighbors helping neighbors, kids playing together, and everyone working toward making Willow Heights a better place. To me, it sounded like paradise. After everything Ethan and I had been through, I thought we'd finally found a place where we could belong. But as it turned out, not everyone saw us the same way I saw us. Our arrival didn't go unnoticed. Within days, there was a knock on our door. Standing there was Karen Wilson, a woman who carried herself like she owned the entire neighborhood. She held a clipboard tightly against her chest, her lips pressed into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Willow Heights," she said, though her tone suggested anything but warmth. "I'm here to make sure you're familiar with the rules." I nodded politely, assuming this was standard procedure. I mean, every neighborhood has rules, right? Things like keeping your lawn tidy or parking in designated areas. It all seemed harmless enough. What I didn't realize at the time was that Karen wasn't just introducing herself. She was sizing us up, deciding whether we fit into her vision of what Willow Heights should be. And unfortunately for us, Ethan and I didn't check all the boxes. Karen's visits became more frequent after that. At first, her complaints were small and almost laughable. She told me Ethan's wind chimes were too loud, even though they barely made a sound. Then she complained about his bird feeders, saying they attracted squirrels. Squirrels. As if that was some kind of crime. Still, I tried to brush it off. Maybe Karen was just overly enthusiastic about keeping the neighborhood pristine. Surely, it couldn't get worse than a few nitpicky comments, could it? But then came the stares from other residents when Ethan flapped his hands excitedly while feeding ducks at the pond, or the whispers behind closed doors when he hummed softly to himself during walks. No one said anything directly to me, but I could feel the tension building. It was like living under a microscope, knowing that every move we made was being scrutinized. Deep down, I knew something bigger was coming. I just didn't know how bad it would get, or how much it would change our lives forever. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. At first, Karen's complaints seemed harmless enough, just petty nitpicking that I figured would fade once she got used to us. But instead of easing up, her criticisms grew sharper and more frequent. Anonymous notes started appearing under our door, each one delivering a new accusation. The wind chimes were disrupting the peace. Ethan's bird feeders were ruining the aesthetic. Even the color of our front door, a soft beige chosen specifically because it matched the neighborhood palette, was suddenly deemed inappropriate. The worst part wasn't the notes themselves. It was the way they made me feel. Every time I found one, my stomach tightened into knots. Was this really about rules, or was it something deeper? Were we being targeted because Ethan was different? I tried telling myself it was all in my head, but the looks from our neighbors told a different story. They avoided eye contact when they passed us on the street. Some even crossed to the other side of the road, as if we carried some invisible stain. It felt like we were living under a cloud of judgment, unable to escape no matter how hard we tried. Then came the neighborhood meeting, a monthly gathering where residents discussed community issues and shared updates. These meetings were supposed to foster connection and cooperation, but under Karen's leadership, they had turned into something else entirely. This particular evening, the air buzzed with tension as people shuffled into folding chairs set up in the community center. I could feel eyes boring into me the moment I walked in, Ethan quietly trailing behind me. Karen took the podium, her clipboard tucked neatly under her arm. She smiled at the crowd, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice smooth and polished. "As always, thank you for coming. Tonight, we need to address some concerns that have been raised about maintaining the standards of Willow Heights." My heart sank. I knew exactly what was coming next. There have been reports of certain behaviors disrupting the harmony of our community. She continued, her gaze flicking briefly in my direction before moving away. "We pride ourselves on being a welcoming and cohesive neighborhood, and unfortunately, not everyone shares those values." The room fell silent except for the occasional murmur rippling through the audience. Someone mentioned noise levels, though Ethan rarely made any noise louder than his quiet hums. Another person cited unusual activity without elaborating further. No names were mentioned, but it didn't matter. I could feel every pair of eyes turning toward me, their stares heavy with accusation. Karen wrapped up her speech with a thinly veiled threat. "If these issues aren't resolved soon," she said, her tone firm, "we may need to reconsider whether all residents are a good fit for Willow Heights." A chill ran down my spine. Her words hung in the air like storm clouds, dark and suffocating. Good fit. Those two little words cut deeper than anything else she'd said, because what Karen really meant was clear. Ethan and I didn't belong here. We weren't the right kind of people for Willow Heights. After the meeting ended, I lingered by the door, clutching Ethan's hand tightly. My mind raced with questions. How could this happen? Hadn't we done everything right? Our house was clean, our yard well kept. Ethan might be different, but he wasn't a problem. He was just himself. And yet, none of that seemed to matter. As we walked home, under the dim glow of streetlights, I replayed Karen's words over and over in my head. A good fit. The phrase echoed like a cruel mantra, twisting tighter around my chest with each step. For the first time since moving to Willow Heights, I wondered if leaving was the only answer. But deep down, I knew running wouldn't solve anything. If Karen thought she could drive us out, she was wrong. This was our home now, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from us. Not without a fight. The days following that neighborhood meeting felt like walking on eggshells. Every knock at the door made my heart race. Every glance from a neighbor left me questioning their intentions. The harassment escalated in ways I hadn't imagined possible. Anonymous notes turned into full-blown letters slipped under our door, each one more accusatory than the last. One claimed Ethan's odd behavior was scaring children, though he rarely interacted with anyone outside our immediate family. Another accused him of ruining property values simply by existing differently. What hurt most wasn't just the words themselves, but the way they isolated us. Neighbors who once smiled politely now avoided us altogether. Some even went out of their way to cross the street when they saw us coming. It was as if we'd become invisible, or worse, pariahs. Even the mail carrier, usually so friendly, started leaving packages at the edge of our driveway instead of bringing them to the door. It was subtle, yes, but unmistakable. We weren't welcome here. And then came the letter. Not another anonymous note slipped under the door, but an official-looking envelope bearing the Willow Heights HOA logo. My hands trembled as I opened it, dreading what I might find inside. Sure enough, it was a formal notice demanding that Ethan cease all disruptive activities within 7 days or face eviction proceedings. The language was cold and clinical, stripping away any humanity from the situation. Reading those words felt like being punched in the gut. I sat down heavily on the couch, the paper shaking in my hands. How could they do this? This wasn't about noise levels or appearances. It was about exclusion. They wanted Ethan gone, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he didn't fit their narrow definition of normalcy. Tears stung my eyes as I thought about how hard we'd worked to make a life here, only to have it ripped away by people who refused to see beyond their own prejudices. That evening, I called Mark, Ethan's father. He and I had been divorced for years, but he still cared deeply about his son and always offered support whenever I needed it. When I told him about the letter, his voice hardened with anger. "You can't let them push you around," he said firmly. "Fight back." "I don't even know where to start," I admitted, my voice breaking. "They'd got the whole neighborhood against us. What am I supposed to do?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mark spoke again. "Actually, there might be something you can do," he said slowly. "Remember that office building downtown? The one you bought last year? You know, the small commercial property." At first, I didn't understand what he was getting at. Then it hit me like a bolt of lightning. That building wasn't just any investment. It housed several businesses, including the Willow Heights HOA. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Karen's smug demeanor, her unchecked authority, her willingness to bully anyone who stepped out of line. All of it stemmed from the belief that no one could touch her. She operated with impunity because she thought she was untouchable, but she hadn't counted on one crucial detail. I owned the very space where she conducted her reign of intimidation. As the realization sank in, a spark of determination ignited within me. For weeks, I felt powerless, like a storm was raging around me and I had no shelter. But now, I saw a glimmer of hope, a way to fight back not just for myself, but for Ethan and everyone else who had ever felt silenced by people like Karen. The next morning, I gathered all the documents related to the office building, the lease agreement, payment records, everything, and headed straight to the HOA's office. My hands were steady, my resolve unshakable. If Karen thought she could drive us out, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control returning. Maybe we couldn't change the world overnight, but we could change this corner of it. And that was enough. For now. The next morning, I walked into the HOA office with my head held high, clutching the lease agreement in one hand and a folder filled with supporting documents in the other. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't just about me or Ethan anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how intimidating the situation felt. Karen looked up from her desk when I entered, startled to see me standing there. Her usual air of superiority faltered for a moment, replaced by confusion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clipped and icy, though I could detect a flicker of unease behind her polished facade. "Yes," I replied, placing the lease agreement squarely on her desk. "You can explain why you're violating the terms of your rental contract by harassing one of your own landlords." Her face went pale as she stared at the document in front of her. She hesitated before picking it up, scanning it quickly as if hoping it would somehow disappear. When she realized what she was looking at, her lips parted in disbelief. This isn't possible," she stammered, glancing up at me as if trying to gauge whether I was bluffing. "You can't." "Oh, but I can," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I leaned forward slightly, making sure she understood the gravity of the situation. "Unless you want me to terminate your lease effective immediately. And trust me, I will. You'll retract every complaint against my son and issue a public apology to the entire neighborhood. Do we understand each other?" For once, Karen had nothing to say. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, searching for words that wouldn't come. The clipboard she always carried, the symbol of her authority, lay forgotten on her desk. For the first time since we'd met, she wasn't in control. I didn't wait for her response. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked out of the office, leaving her speechless and scrambling. As I stepped outside, a wave of relief washed over me. It wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming power. For weeks, Karen had made me feel small, insignificant, like my voice didn't matter. But now, the tables had turned. She'd underestimated me, assuming I wouldn't fight back, and that mistake would cost her dearly. Word spread quickly through Willow Heights. By the end of the day, everyone knew. The woman fighting back against Karen's tyranny was the same person paying her rent. Neighbors who had once avoided us suddenly became friendly, offering awkward apologies and explanations for their silence. Some even admitted they'd been intimidated into compliance, too afraid to speak out against Karen's iron grip. One elderly man stopped me on the sidewalk, his eyes brimming with regret. "We should have said something sooner," he muttered. "I'm sorry." It wasn't just the residents who changed. The HOA itself began to crumble without Karen's leadership. Meetings that were once dominated by her sharp tongue and rigid rules devolved into chaos. Attendance dwindled to almost nothing, and decisions stalled as no one stepped up to fill the void she left behind. Without her micromanagement, the organization unraveled faster than anyone expected. As for Karen, she retreated from view almost entirely. Gone were the clipboard-carrying visits, the smug smiles, the thinly veiled threats. She avoided eye contact whenever our paths crossed, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. It was a stark contrast to the woman who had once strutted around the neighborhood like she owned it. Now she was just another resident, humiliated, powerless, and stripped of the authority she'd wielded so recklessly. But while justice felt sweet, it didn't erase everything. The scars of those weeks still lingered, not just for me, but for Ethan, who had endured stares and whispers simply for being himself. And yet, knowing that we had fought back gave me strength. We hadn't let fear dictate our lives. We hadn't backed down. In a world that often tries to silence people like Ethan, standing up for him meant more than words could express. Still, part of me wondered, was this enough? Exposing Karen's hypocrisy had given us leverage, but it hadn't healed the wounds she'd inflicted, or the mistrust that remained among neighbors. Could Willow Heights ever truly become the community I'd hoped for when we first arrived? Or was it too broken to fix? Only time would tell. But for now, I allowed myself a small measure of peace. We had won this battle. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward winning the war. In the weeks that followed, Willow Heights began to feel like a different place. The weight of Karen's influence had lifted, leaving behind an almost eerie quiet. Without her constant interference, the neighborhood seemed unsure of how to move forward. Some residents tried to act as though nothing had happened, avoiding eye contact and sticking to their routines. Others, however, approached me with apologies, halting, awkward attempts to make amends for staying silent, while Karen ran rampant over anyone who didn't fit her vision of perfection. One afternoon, as I was planting flowers in our front garden, a young mother named Lisa stopped by. She held her daughter Lily's hand tightly, glancing around nervously before speaking. "I wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Seeing how you stood up for your son, it gave me courage." Her words caught me off guard. Courage. I hadn't thought about it that way. To me, standing up to Karen wasn't heroic. It was necessary. But as Lisa went on to explain, I realized just how much impact our actions had on others. Lily, her daughter, had cerebral palsy, and Lisa admitted she'd been terrified to move to Willow Heights after hearing stories about Karen's intolerance. "I thought we have to hide parts of ourselves to fit in," she said softly. "But seeing you fight back made me realize we don't have to do that here. Not anymore." Her gratitude brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I'd felt isolated, like Ethan and I were fighting this battle alone. But now, I saw that our struggle had resonated with others, people who had also felt silenced or pushed aside. By refusing to back down, we hadn't just reclaimed our own dignity. We'd opened the door for others to live authentically too. As the HOA continued to unravel, a group of residents came together to form a voluntary neighborhood council. Unlike the old HOA, this new organization focused on collaboration rather than control. They invited me to join, which surprised me at first. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I trusted the idea of getting involved again. But when I attended one of their early meetings, I saw genuine effort, a desire to rebuild trust, and create a true sense of community. The turning point came during a discussion about inclusivity. One member suggested hosting events where neighbors could share their hobbies and talents. Someone else proposed creating a buddy system to help newcomers feel welcome. As ideas flowed freely, I found myself speaking up more than I expected. I talked about Ethan's love for birds and suggested setting up birdhouses throughout the neighborhood. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized something bigger, a celebration of individuality instead of conformity. Over time, these changes started to take root. Slowly but surely, Willow Heights began to transform, not overnight, but in subtle, meaningful ways. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now exchanged greetings and shared stories. Kids played together without fear of judgment. Even Ethan noticed the shift. He smiled more often, his laughter echoing through the house as he sketched birds and pressed wildflower petals into his notebook. Still, I couldn't shake the lingering questions in my mind. Had justice truly been served? Exposing Karen's hypocrisy had given us leverage, yes, but it hadn't erased the pain she'd caused, or the scars left behind. Part of me wondered if forgiveness was even possible. Could the same people who had turned a blind eye to bullying ever fully regain my trust? These thoughts weighed heavily on me, especially late at night when the house grew quiet. But then I'd look at Ethan, peacefully sketching by the window, and remind myself why we'd fought so hard. This wasn't just about revenge or proving a point. It was about building something better, something real. And maybe that was enough. For now, months passed, and Willow Heights continued to evolve in ways I never thought possible. The old HOA was officially dissolved, its remnants fading into memory like a bad dream. In its place, the voluntary neighborhood council took shape, driven by residents who genuinely cared about creating a kinder, more inclusive community. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was hope in the air, a sense that we were moving toward something better. For Ethan and me, life became easier. The constant stares and whispers disappeared, replaced by genuine smiles and friendly waves. Neighbors no longer avoided us. Instead, they went out of their way to include us. Mrs. Patel, who lived 2 doors down, started inviting Ethan to help her plant flowers in her garden. "He has such a green thumb," she'd say with a warm smile. And Mr. Thompson, an older man who used to complain about Ethan's wind chimes, now stopped by regularly to admire his bird sketches. "You've got real talent, kiddo," he'd tell him, ruffling Ethan's hair affectionately. These small acts of kindness meant more to me than words could express. They reminded me that people aren't always defined by their worst moments or by the fear others instill in them. When given the chance, most folks want to do the right thing. All they need is someone to lead the way. Karen, on the other hand, eventually moved away. No big announcement, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet departure one weekend while everyone else was busy with their lives. Her house sat empty for weeks before new tenants moved in, a young couple with a toddler who loved chasing butterflies in the park. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of Karen driving through the neighborhood, her car slowing as she passed our house. She never waved or smiled, but I didn't expect her to. Some wounds run too deep for reconciliation, and honestly, I didn't feel the need to reach out. What mattered most was that she no longer held power over us, or anyone else. Still, I found myself reflecting on Karen often. What drove her to wield authority so cruelly? Was it fear of losing control, a desperate need to belong, or simply ignorance, born from a lifetime of privilege and narrow-mindedness? I may never know the answers, and perhaps it's better that way. Holding on to anger would only weigh me down, and I refused to let her have that kind of hold over me anymore. Instead, I focused on the future, for Ethan, for our neighbors, and for all the families who deserved a place where they could feel safe and accepted. That's why I agreed to stay involved with the neighborhood council, even though part of me still hesitated to trust completely. Every meeting felt like a step forward, a chance to rewrite the rules of what it means to be a community. We organized events that celebrated diversity, art shows featuring local talents, including Ethan sketches, potluck dinners where everyone shared dishes from their cultures, and workshops teaching skills like gardening and woodworking. One evening, during a community picnic, I watched Ethan sitting under a tree, sketching a blue jay perched on a nearby branch. A group of children gathered around him, fascinated by his drawings. One little girl asked if he could teach her how to draw birds, and to my surprise, Ethan nodded shyly, handing her a pencil. As they worked together, giggling and pointing at the birds flitting overhead, my chest swelled with pride. This was what Willow Heights was supposed to be, a place where differences weren't just tolerated but celebrated. That night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, I kissed his forehead and whispered, "I'm proud of you." He looked up at me, his eyes shining with happiness, and hugged me tightly. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace. Life isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning from it and using those lessons to build something stronger. Willow Heights wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for now, that was enough. Today, Willow Heights feels like a completely different place. The streets are alive with laughter and chatter again, the kind that makes you feel warm inside. Kids race their bikes down sidewalks, dogs bark happily in backyards, and neighbors greet each other warmly instead of casting suspicious glances. It's not perfect, no neighborhood ever is, but it's real. And that's what matters most. Ethan continues to thrive in ways I couldn't have imagined when we first moved here. His bird sketches have become something of a local treasure, displayed proudly at community events, and even featured in a small art gallery downtown. People stop me all the time to tell me how much they admire his work, how it reminds them to slow down and notice the beauty around them. For someone who has always struggled to communicate verbally, Ethan's art has given him a voice and the confidence to share it with the world. Our garden is another source of joy for him. What started as a few wildflowers planted along the driveway has turned into a vibrant sanctuary bursting with color and life. Bees buzz lazily between blossoms, and butterflies flit from one petal to the next. Ethan spends hours out there, tending to his plants or sketching the wildlife that visits. Sometimes, other kids join him, sitting quietly beside him as he teaches them how to draw birds or identify different species. Watching those moments fills me with gratitude, not just for Ethan's growth, but for the way our neighbors have embraced him. The neighborhood council continues to grow stronger, too. Monthly meetings are lively and productive, filled with ideas about how to make Willow Heights an even better place. Last spring, we organized a community cleanup day, where residents came together to plant trees and repaint playground equipment. This fall, we're planning a harvest festival complete with pumpkin carving, hay rides, and homemade treats. These events may seem small, but they've brought us closer together, reminding us that we're all connected by more than just shared streets and sidewalks. Still, I think often about the lessons this journey has taught me. Standing up to Karen wasn't just about protecting Ethan. It was about proving that kindness and courage can overcome fear and intolerance. It showed me that change is possible, even in places where it feels impossible. But it also reminded me that building trust takes time. While many neighbors have earned my respect and friendship, there are still moments when old doubts creep in. That's okay. Healing isn't linear, and neither is forgiveness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I sat on the porch with Ethan. He was flipping through his sketchbook, pointing out his favorite drawings and giggling softly. I wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "You know," I said, leaning my head against his, "we did good, didn't we?" He looked up at me, his eyes shining, and nodded. In that moment, I realized that winning wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about creating a space where everyone, regardless of ability, background, or differences, could belong. A place where people could be themselves without fear of judgment. Willow Heights isn't paradise. There will always be challenges ahead, disagreements to navigate, and misunderstandings to resolve. But it's ours. Together, we've built something worth fighting for, a community rooted in acceptance, compassion, and hope. And as long as Ethan and I have each other, and this little corner of the world, we'll keep moving forward, one step at a time.